Welcome to the Human Odyssey, the podcast about human-centered design. The way humans learn, behave, and perform is a science, and having a better understanding of this can help improve your business, your work, and your life. This program is presented by Sophic Synergistics, the experts in human-centered design. So, let's get started on today's Human Odyssey.
Hello, and welcome to the Human Odyssey podcast. I am Rachel, and I'm going to be your moderator for this episode about the wonderful world of medical devices and how you can get the perfect design. And I'm here with Jen.
Hi, good to be here. Excited to talk about the human component of human-centered design and medical device.
Also, Cynthia is here.
Hey, Rachel. We're looking forward to this topic. It's a pretty prevalent one these days.
Yeah. And finally, Raquel.
Hey everyone, excited to be here and speak about medical devices and just my experience with them and what I know.
So, I think, a good place to start for everybody, since, the whole world isn't attuned to human-centered design and what that means in terms of medical devices. We show up for care. We don't really understand what goes into, getting the practitioners and the devices that we need to support our care require. And so I think that's where we should probably start the story. And so human-centered design is a large part of that story in terms of how products and services get to market to help support people when they get sick, injured, or some combination of the two. And the FDA is also a large part of this in terms of regulating the businesses or companies that come to the table with innovative solutions to make sure that we cause no harm, right? So that's a pretty prevalent term in the medical care industry. And so human-centered design's focus is just that: do no harm, but cause, create a situation of the most good, not only from reducing the risk to people and providers, but also optimizing outcomes for people in terms of their interactions with healthcare. And again, that runs the gamut from, how your experience goes with providers and how delivery of care goes, whether we're talking about a clinic or a hospital setting or at home. And so that's sort of the 50,000 foot level of human-centered design in the health space. And I think Jen probably has some other words to add there from the applied health perspective.
Yeah, thanks. As you mentioned, it's more and more prevalent. So the idea of using technology and the remote application of technology is expanding exponentially. One, because the capabilities have been definitely growing for a while and the familiarity with them, but the pandemic drove, a very acute need to get medical care out into the hands of the patients to deliver data back to the providers rather than seeing someone in person. So that was the next step function change in how people perceived, the value of devices and software to get information about their health and then get it into the hands of providers so that they could be diagnosed or provided the right treatment. And, there's a lot wrapped up in there because, when you talk about human-centered design, I think, people zero in on the patient. What are you measuring? How are you measuring it? What's the evidence base so you can interpret the data? But there's many other humans involved in the full life cycle of a device or software that's doing that. You got to consider, technicians that might be involved or home healthcare providers, the physicians themselves, and other people who manage data who are in the mix that might be driving the types of information that move between the patient and the provider, and they're going to have an impact, or the software is going to have an impact on that. And then how do we get confidence in all of the components, the hardware, the software, and the people, so that we achieve those better outcomes, Cynthia, you were mentioning, because that's really where that's the so what. If you're not doing any type of risk reduction, improvement of outcomes, accelerating access to care, the question is why? Why are you doing this? Why do you matter? And there's a discovery road that has to give some latitude, but that's the research side. But when it goes into actually, when you're trying to move that research into clinical care and move through the regulatory pathways, you better be able to demonstrate that you have a solid rationale, and you're going to be improving things, either again outcomes or access, that are really going to matter.
And I think that's an excellent point, because that's where a lot of misperception too, when people think about the FDA and, you have a company that's desperate to get new technologies to market. There's often a viewpoint that the regulatory process slows things down or hinders innovation because it's regulatory. But I think the major point that people miss is that the regulatory process is there to make sure you do all the right things so that you are successful once you get to market, and that you don't hurt someone, and then you end up, with a whole slew of other issues, and potentially are no longer a viable company. And so I think sometimes we don't think about the 360-degree view of product development, and once you get to market, in the goal of the regulatory process, and making sure things are safe and effective for people. Because as Jen points out, you have a multitude of different types of users depending on what type of solution you're introducing, and you've got to understand their environment and their approach to use soup to nuts to make sure you don't introduce new hazards that you didn't intend to.
There's also a thing in the regulatory process where it's like the regulatory process is not perfect. That's why you need more HCD in the process, because it still could hurt somebody even if it passes through FDA.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. I think it's also a misnomer that if you get FDA approval, you're automatically a success, and that's not true either.
Yeah, I think there's some, I agree. The regulatory pathway is designed to build rigor into the system and drive processes and checks and balances to give yourself, either the developer and or the patient, it has this seal that it's gone through this process, and I should have some confidence that, again, most of the time we realize the idea of zero harm is not realistic, even if it's minuscule, it's inconsequential, but it still gets on the list. That's why those, I'm more aware of it, like with the drug development, and even for anyone who watches TV and hears the commercials, and they're going to give you the laundry list of all the bad side effects, and you're like, well, why? I'm having a hard time understanding why anyone would take this. But so they have to say those things, but it's never balanced. Like, you don't understand the context, the ratio. But in the concept of the FDA process, and to your point, Rachel, it is not perfect. And that, we've coming back again from, my prior career with aerospace, there are different areas you have to work in, which are the known problems, right? But usually the problem you're trying to solve, the technical problems and challenges to get the measurements you're looking for, the interpretation of the measurements, those usually are really entrenched in history and evidence base. And there's a lot of meat there to work with to understand what you're doing. And then there's the things I know I don't know. Those are the gaps, and the regulatory process, I think, really helps with the gaps. It's going to make you ask those questions you didn't know to ask. It's going to talk about, maybe demographics, for populations you didn't anticipate, or it's really going to try to drive out the gaps. And either you're going to get those gaps filled, or the transparency is there that says, we're not designed to fill that gap. That's when you really start parsing what exactly you are relevant to, and you document that. The next area is the tough one. The I don't know what I don't know. And that's typically found in the phase 4, when you might have gotten FDA approval, but we could not or didn't know how to anticipate this gap or this use of it or this interpretation. So that's where there's room to learn. And what you're trying to do is minimize the ability to hurt someone while you're doing that phase 4, that they may not get benefit. That should be the worst case scenario, but they did not get harm. So it's tricky though, because especially with new technology, where it's not a version of a prior application or technology, you're gonna hit the I don't know what I don't know. But there are definitely methodologies that help you work through it, whether it's, and this is where any company should be interested in that kind of rigor, whether it's aligned with the regulatory or not. That makes you better, right? And safer and and lower risk, but it is a financial investment. And that's when you start to get into the business side of things of, well, how much do we invest to find out the I don't know what I don't know before I'm made to or before I'm forced to. So there's some balance there in the business case that does is realistic.
So we've been talking about the process of regulatory and so what exactly would be the process to get a device signed off by the FDA, including these HCD or human-centered design approach to medical devices to design?
And so that's a great question, because I think it's not an obvious pathway in certain respects. I think, what's well understood is the clinical regulatory part of the pathway. What's lesser understood, and forgive me for putting it that way, is the human-centered design pathway. It's a parallel process, and it often isn't integrated well to understand which activity comes first to help you make that next step towards clinical trials. And a lot of folks separate the two as their independent tasks and almost a check the box activity when it comes to human-centered design. And that is the exact wrong approach to take. It's the most expensive and the most risk-filled posture you could take in terms of, getting to the finish line and submitting to the FDA. And, what companies fail to realize is it starts on the design floor when you have a concept of something. And all too often we move right to prototyping and developing the widget because we have an idea. But what we've failed to understand is, do we know that there's truly a problem out there that this idea solves in terms of, providing a real solution to a problem set that we understand? And do we understand the end users? And a lot of times, these ideas or innovations come from people's experience in the healthcare system. You get a lot of doctors or medical professionals or people who are on the periphery that have been doing certain things and notice there's a need to solve a certain aspect of it, but they only understand it from their perspective. And what they fail to appreciate is they're not the end user. And so, when we talk about the product design process, that's where it begins. Knowing that you're not the user if you're the creator, right? And knowing that you've got to do some additional research outside of yourself to appreciate what the market space, as Jen pointed out, the business aspect of this really is, to continue on your path. And that also sets you up for all of those things from, risk, good risk due diligence and understanding where your opportunities really are.
Yeah, I think from my experience, a lot of companies want to jump right into testing, right? They have that mid-level prototype and they want to say, no, we want to get it in front of users. What do they think about it? But really, there's a lot of way that design can be impacted and changed before even having users interact with it, just by getting to know them, doing observations, just having human-centered design experts break down the device. How would we getting out of that space that they know how to use the product, that them as designers, engineers know how they're think that they are the users, and making them realize, what, there are other ways that this could be used. So I think just because, like, from what I've seen, companies are really eager to start testing, and they don't always realize the value of getting that foundational research in, and how that can really set them up to where if we finally do testing, we're doing it with, like, finding the errors that we couldn't predict, so that by the time they get to summative, they're 100% confident that their product is going to pass and be past that final validation test.
Yeah, and Raquel brings up a lot of great points, because we've also seen this time and time again. It's the most common condition. They've already got a prototype, or they've already done, in their mind, conscientious testing, because they've walked it across to their buddy down the hall and asked them if they liked it, right? That's not a test, but it's a pretty common response. And so we've spent the last 6 or 7 years doing a lot of support for incubator organizations, including the Texas Medical Center. And we've helped a lot of companies. But the very first question I asked them when they come see me, I was like, what is the problem? Did you do your research to really understand the problem space? And 9 times out of 10, they just look at you and they'll give me the answer back that, well, I was a practitioner and this was a problem for me. well, that's your red flag number one, that you've got to go back. You're missing some data points, and it may prove out that you're 100% right, but you've got to do that step to make sure that you're even in the zone of a viable product. Forget everything else.
Another problem is you have to make observations to make sure your implementation is going to go smoothly, because if it causes one little bump in people's workflow, they'll just not use it.
Correct, and that's a good point. You have to make sure you understand the environment of use for a good data set of practitioners to kind of understand what the 85% cases of how people operate, within their different environments, to appreciate the challenges that maybe you don't experience, but they do.
And I think sometimes, to both Raquel and Cynthia's points, when people, they want to rush, right? They feel behind, but it's because time is money, especially for the small startups. Now we've tried to, educate and show data that says, if you don't invest in these things, kind of meter yourself so you're doing the right things as fast as you can. But if you skip steps or ignore them, you're going to pay the price later. Like literally financially pay the price, but mostly schedule hit if you've got the money to go back and do redesign. But it'll be a significant delay that was way worse than slowing down a little bit of the progress you would have made had you done the steps. And then the worst case scenario is getting through having a significant gap that, results in harm. And those are ones that there are case studies out there. Like how did, we need to learn from, like, how did this get there? How was this allowed even via the regulatory process? And that's when you see those process escapes. But, the answer is the investment up front to do it well and make sure that you do all of those steps pays off later. It may feel like a delay, but you kind of gotta calm yourself down. You got to realize that investment is very much worthwhile and will pay off. And ultimately, I think, has proved itself to make you more agile later and move faster. It's a little bit of that, rabbit in the hair or turtle in the hair. It's tortoise in the hair, kind of how fast you think you're moving fast, but you're going to run into significant delays.
Yeah, and depending on which regulatory pathway fits you and how much interaction you have with the FDA throughout your process, you doing a sound approach to human-centered design actually starts gaining their confidence and trust in you as a company, and actually helps make that process easier and helps accelerate it in a sense, because they now understand that you understand all of the right things to do, and that they have a little bit more confidence in your ability to identify and buy down risk by incorporating it early and often. And again, you're constantly having a touch point with the FDA. It's not this, confrontational type situation that a lot of people like to make it out to be. The more open kimono you are with them, the easier it will be for you. And again, if you've got the guidance of outside professionals helping you, even better, that helps gain confidence. Because when you don't do this, and we've had certain circumstances where, companies have been misguided for whatever reason, got bad information, we've had to step in and have those hard conversations that you have to stop and go back to the starting line a little bit and reevaluate the design, because you're not going to get through the regulatory process. And even if you decide to go through, you're going to kill their confidence in your company, and it's going to be a laborious process, because they're going to go over everything you've done with a fine-tooth comb because you didn't do your due diligence first.
Another aspect is user training and retraining, which is one of the most expensive processes as well, because humans are expensive. If you do it correctly the first time, it's going to be easier just to train your users, because it's going to be more usable in general. And then if there's something wrong and you have to redesign, you'll have to retrain them, which again is very expensive.
Yeah, training is a kind of an ugly word in human factors. We always associate training with and equate it with a bad design, right? And, unfortunately with complex systems, you have to have a little bit of training, but the ideal state is taking advantage of what they know how to do and integrating it so seamlessly into their understanding and workflow that it's that it's seamless and the training is easy and almost intuitive in that nature, because what you don't want to do is have something that is so divergent from what they know and understand and how they operate. To Rachel's earlier point, they'll just avoid it or work around it or not use it, or you're setting yourself up for a catastrophic mistake when workload or stress overcome that human being in a critical environment. And so it's a balance, but it all goes back to understanding your target market and their environment of use to really understand what that system has to do and how it has to support, and also what are you inheriting from other processes, good or bad, and other system designs, good or bad, that you can't control, but you need to account for because it also plays into your risk quotient. This is another big miss for companies. They don't realize that they are responsible for the whole workflow and process and how other systems interact with their own system.
Yeah, that's a good point. I want to go into the future a little bit and talk about software as a medical device, which is a new and emerging a medical device where you just have software on your Apple Watch that tells you all of these health implications and how that can affect the future of regulation.
This is another fun one because this is where rapid prototyping is exponentially even faster than what we can do with other products. And I think it's even at a point where it's overtaxing the FDA, and they're looking at a lot of different models in terms of bringing on outside experts to help them review other companies in terms of the human-centered design component, because there's so much risk involved with software. Not all data is good, and not all data is used in the right way, and so that it can have bad outcomes. So a big element of fear and safety, from the FDA perspective is, what is this person going to do with the data? Is the data designed in the right way to elicit the right behavior? Meaning, we don't cause undue panic. We don't push this user to make poor interpretations or assumptions about their health, and then they exercise their right to be their personal MD without the right guidance. And so there's all sorts of risk factors involved with putting healthcare into people's hands. Now, it's not to say I don't believe in this. I'm a full proponent that knowledge is power, but it takes good design and good understanding of how people internalize information and how they act upon it to do it right.
Yeah, so I would say it's going to be change the definition of harm. Instead of you're thinking of physical harm in general with medical devices, you're changing it to mental harm, emotional harm, and things like that.
I think it's part of it, but I think there is still a huge physical harm component. And, I think, Jen has some insights too from her world that she can bring to bear on this one.
Yeah, it's definitely, you got to connect some dots for folks sometimes to get to the physical one. And so what Rachel was talking about is real. Like, people are going to receive information. So they used a word that was key: knowledge. So data is not knowledge. Information is not necessarily knowledge. There's another part of the process. And we think of it, very intuitively, like your brain takes it in, it compares it to other information it has, and results in something that's considered knowledge, because now you're going to act on it or choose not to, but you it becomes information that's transformed into something greater in value than just the bits and bytes. So I think there's a lot of healthy speculation, and should be a lot of evaluation of the software as a medical device, because let's say that the hardware is the same. Let's just, use these watches, whatever brand you wear. These watches are gathering data, lots of data, lots and lots of data. And they deliver some output, which at that point becomes knowledge, right? Like, just getting a heart rate number isn't necessarily knowledge. If that number exceeds a value or go below a value, and there's like an alarm associated with that, and then you should take an action, that's trying to turn data into knowledge. Now, Cynthia, what you were referring to is where, like, trying to understand, when does providing knowledge, because I totally agree with you, knowledge is power. Now you can take action about your own life and your own well-being, and anticipate, if you're vulnerable, potentially a bad outcome, and go get help early. Like, that is the, I think, the endeavor that everyone's after for the most part. But you could go in a way where people now it's treatment. When does it cross from knowledge to take action to now that knowledge is used in a treatment way. And that's the one where you're like, is that information fair game? Is it generalizable enough and actionable in a way that makes sense safely for someone? So right now, let's frame it as one of the watches is approved to do ECG that can deliver a result, and it's only allowed to talk about atrial fibrillation, right? Because the other things are harder and more complex to detect. So it can tell you abnormal, right? More like binary. You're normal, it's good, or you're healthy and you're fit if you mix it with other data, if it has other metadata context. But in general, if you just use the watch to do the ECG, it's just trying to understand atrial fib. But I believe that's a big risk for elderly people. It causes a lot of people to pass out. It can be dangerous, but it's treatable, very treatable. But you need to go get medical help. And some people, they don't perceive it, right? Maybe for whatever reason, they have no sense that this is happening to them. So the watch is giving them knowledge to go act on. However, someone could take it much further. And third-party apps now are using the same hardware, right? It's taking that same watch you have, you buy a third-party app, it's taking the data. First of all, you're sharing your data. Do you know what's happening to your data? Maybe not. But there's all kinds of privacy issues. But the third-party app is delivering much different output than your watch did and the way it was approved. So now you've got, now it's straight up software as a medical device because it's using somebody else's hardware. And now you got to watch what this thing is delivering and has it crossed a line? Does the evidence base, out there in the medical industry support and medical research areas support the interpretation? Is that interpretation aligned with best guidelines from, American Academy of whatever specialty? And are you going to skip seeing a physician because you have this watch and this third-party app and wind up dead in the street because you misdiagnosed yourself? So this is where medical software as a medical device needs a really healthy conversation. It needs to be ongoing because these tools are kind of limitless, right? Data acquisition is hardware-based, sensor-based, but once data is generated, it could be shared infinitely. And that's when things kind of spiral a little bit. You're like, it's a Wild West. How do we make sure we're going toward good and away from bad? And I think the software realm is struggling with that right now.
Yeah, definitely. One of my friends actually passed out, and I think if they had this device, they could have figured out, was it my heart just speeding up? And it could have been a incredibly deadly disease like POTS, or not really incredibly deadly, but it could be like an autoimmune disease.
More dangerous, yeah.
Yeah, like POTS, or he could have just been dehydrated and his heart went above the median real quick and he passed out because, meh.
Yeah, there are many case studies on where things went awry for reasons when especially in the case of passing out and trying to unpack why a human body would do that, and simple things that could be corrected like dehydration, electrolyte imbalance. It was about getting dehydrated, and maybe it was hot out, which is not uncommon here in the South. But then there are neurological disorders, there are cardiac disorders. I mean, it runs a gamut, and you're going to need professional help and diagnosis to get that. But just getting an alert from a watch that says you're vulnerable to that happening, hopefully can get you into the care, and this is also early diagnosis and going back to preventing harm. The benefit is this person didn't have to have the bad medical event. We saw the risk factors emerging, and that detection turned into knowledge, which then could be acted upon. But it's very contextual and a lot of times requires expert interpretation, which is more at, the medical professional level, not a third-party app. Apps, and sorry, I'd let you chime in, but, this is where that tension between accessibility and specialty, you want more people to get the medical care, but how do you make sure it gets delivered well?
Yeah, I think, the desirements are driving us to be a more preventative, proactive, healthcare model, but it comes with an uncomfortable, give and take, push and pull of control and power. And how much are we willing to allow people to control their own medical care, in a sense, versus, hanging on to the old school medical model. And I don't think either one is ready for an either or situation. I think it's both, but I think there has to be a shift. And this is probably a discussion for a future podcast, because it's wrought with human factors elements in terms of how do you shift your expectations and your models of behavior to now embrace the ability to have a more collaborative model to healthcare. And, I'm all for this personally, because I think everybody, if they can take the time to be educated in the right manner and use the data wisely, it's the right choice, because there's not enough doctors and not enough, avenues for healthcare for everybody to get seen the way they need to. And again, another conversation for another day, but it makes it uncomfortable for all of the regulatory processes and all of the medical care providers and all of the litigators in the world, because how much risk are you putting in the system and how much risk are we willing to accept, right?
So, there's cultural aspects to this, and the U.S. is a very litigious nation compared to other nations. And if you look at them and, so this is really a learning process. And you say, as a culture, how much risk are we willing to take? People sometimes feel uninformed, even though they signed off all of the, the sheets and sheets of disclosures. Sometimes it's hard to read. I mean, that's my gripe, is that, if you're going to be signing something that says you understand the risks, they should be written in clear language. The legalese has a place in time, but, putting that in where someone's really trying to just understand, like, what could this do to me? And then maybe some percentages. That's where I think it's a little hard to understand and judge. But this is a learning opportunity. But how much risk are we going to go at? And there's many people, it's called biohacking. I wear a lot of tech. I'm very interested in the data. Do I act on all of it? No, I'm kind of a watch and wait kind of person. And I'm judging, to your point, like I want it to be collaborative, and I actually drive it myself to be that way. Not everybody reciprocates. Because there is an old school model, and they're also put in a position of like, well, you got a 15-minute appointment. I can't sit here and talk to you and speculate about the future. But I agree with you. Accessibility, access, education are all important components of it. But the user, it's a little bit buyer beware, and you have to understand, if you want those things and you want to engage in those things, you also have to act responsibly. And maybe that's where the education is. It has to be partnered with the actual technology and the software, so people can engage that way and push healthcare, in a direction where we think it is more collaborative and we can do more prevention. That would be so key, so key. If we knew what to measure, what is the biomarker, if we knew what the biomarkers meant when, and then help give people some direction about how to make better choices to prevent the eventuality.
Yeah, and that's really key to why I brought up this, menagerie of topics and where, the potential and opportunity that we have ahead, because really human-centered design plays the role in solving all of these problems on different levels. Again, it's not the only answer, but it's a critical element for us to be able to do this safely and effectively. Like forget just the, the design process and the regulatory process as it is, understanding the goals and human behavior and how to use data appropriately, that in and of itself is its own thing, separate from, the regulatory and design process, and it's all part of it, but we don't consider it as a continuum.
Yeah, and I think that's a wonderful note to wrap up on. And I want to thank you, ladies, for joining me on the third episode of season 2 of the Human Odyssey podcast. And I would like to also thank the listeners. You can also check out our social media platforms for more human-centered content.
Thank you. This is a great topic. Had fun.
The Human Odyssey is presented by Sophic Synergistics, the experts in human-centered design. Find out more at sophicsynergistics.com. Get smart. Get Sophic smart.